think for a lot of people, the big concern with the 4060 Ti is the 8 gigabytes of VRAM. So I was really curious if we tried out a very VRAM heavy title like The Last of Us Part 1, whether the older and slower 6700 XT with 12 gigabytes of VRAM would show a performance advantage. And sure enough, I am seeing it. Now, this is on the latest patch, 1.0.5.0, which actually handles VRAM better than the original launch release, but I'm still seeing the 6700 XT 16% faster at 1080p ultra settings. However, if we go down to the high settings, which do a much better job at staying within an 8 gigabyte VRAM buffer, that lead greatly diminishes, and both GPUs are performing around 100 FPS in this scene, so it is actually running very well on both of them. Now we're seeing a 2% lead on the 6700 XT, although the 1% lows are showing an 11% lead, so the VRAM budget could still be here. Also, this game does look a lot better at the high settings than it did compared to launch, and like I said, it stays much better into its VRAM budget. Now, as we go up resolution and go back to the ultra settings to 1440p, once again, the 6700 XT is reporting it's allocating 11 gigabytes and using 10 gigabytes. The 8 gigabyte card doesn't have that, and the 6700 XT is getting an 18% lead in the averages, but a 37% lead in the 1% lows, as the 4060 Ti has to wait for accessing information from the system RAM. If we go down to high settings at 1440p, this 4060 Ti claws back a little bit of its performance and actually is averaging over 60 FPS through this scene, although it is an 11% lead for the 6700 XT and a 16% lead in the 1% lows. And like I said, this is actually running better than the game did at launch, where it was even more of a VRAM hog. So interesting stuff. They are both going with decent playable frame rates there at 1440p high settings. Now, another way to try to get VRAM under control is to use upscaling. So here we're looking at 1440p ultra settings, but using DLSS and FSR too at the quality setting. And that is getting the 4060 Ti actually a lead here by 6%, both of them over 70 FPS. So this seems to be helping out quite a bit. Also, image quality-wise, I do think DLSS looks better than FSR2 in most cases, including in this game. Now, not that you'd really be using either of these GPUs at 4K most likely, but I thought I'd test it out anyway at 4K high settings, not ultra settings. The 6700 XT has a 9% lead on the averages and actually a 56% lead on the 1% lows. And if you look at the frame time graph on the 4060 Ti, it is very stuttery and the 1% lows drop extremely low. But really, they're both kind of a 30 FPS experience here, which, I mean, you could play the game that way, but I really don't think these GPUs are either of them targeting 4K. However, I think it would be unfair if we only focused on VRAM-heavy titles and did not look at heavy ray tracing titles, where Nvidia's advantage is going to be. So here is 1080p ray tracing ultra settings in Cyberpunk 2077. We can see at these settings, the 6700 XT, and this is native 1080p, no upscaling at this point. The 6700 XT is down in the 20s. The RTX 4060 Ti is at least playable in the 40s. That is a 69% lead over the 6700 XT and a 62% lead in the 1% lows. Now, that's without frame generation. I am showing frame generation, which is available in Cyberpunk. That does get it up into the 70s, but if you look at the average PC latency, the latency increase when you're starting from a low base frame rate, I feel like is too much to make this particularly usable. So despite it getting it to 73 FPS, it's not going to feel responsive enough, in my opinion. I would want a higher base frame rate for it to be more usable, which is actually what we see here. So if we enable DLSS and FSR2 at the quality setting, we now see that the 6700 XT is at least somewhat playable in the mid-40s. The 4060 Ti is up into the 70s without frame generation. And because that gets the latency down a lot lower, then the latency increase you get, which you can see at the bottom of the screen with the little Nvidia overlay, with frame generation enabled, isn't too bad. And you actually get over 100 FPS, and the image quality artifacts are also lessened because the difference between each frame that it's interpolating between isn't as bad. In other words, I actually think that this is a very usable experience here. Frame generation with DLSS quality. Also, DLSS quality at 1080p upscaling, while it's not great, it looks a lot better than FSR2 upscaling does at 1080p. And just overall, without the frame generation, we are seeing a 73% performance advantage at these settings. So in other words, you can get a much more usable ray tracing and upscaling situation, possibly with some frame generation at 1080p. However, Cyberpunk did get updated with the path tracing update, RT Overdrive. And this is even with DLSS/FSR2 quality. The 4060 Ti is getting into the 30s. Frame generation would boost it, but it would have too much latency for, in my opinion, to be usable. The 6700 XT just isn't working. It can't even keep up. It's getting completely out of sync here. So you're not going to be using the RT Overdrive on your 6700 XT, but really you're only getting in the 30 FPS range on the 4060 Ti. You could go to the performance upscaling mode, and now the 4060 Ti is a lot more playable, up into the 50s and even higher sometimes. However, I don't think the image quality looks very good. Now, at the performance setting at 1080p, FSR just looks completely blurry mess, but even DLSS, while it looks significantly better than FSR does, I think the native 1080p image looks better, and it's just not really an acceptable sacrifice to make, in my opinion, to get the higher frame rate with RT Overdrive. Now, this is a 300% let me put this, a 3 times performance difference between the two GPUs. The 4060 Ti is 3 times the speed of the 6700 XT at these settings, and it looks significantly better because at these aggressive settings, the upscaling does look better with DLSS. However, you could just not turn on path tracing. If you don't turn on path tracing, then you can play at a native 1080p resolution at the normal ultra settings with no ray tracing at almost 100 FPS on the 4060 Ti and over 90 FPS on the 6700 XT. This is an 8% lead for the 4060 Ti. On the averages, the 1% lows are about tied, and both of them get a very good experience here. The game feels responsive. It still looks good at the ultra settings. Now, if you go up to 1440p at the ultra settings, they are both averaging right around 60 FPS. The 4060 Ti is just a little bit ahead, only by about 5% here. It does feel like at the higher resolution, we had a smaller lead for the 4060 Ti. I would imagine you'd be hard-pressed to notice the difference between the two if you had a blind test here, with only a 5% difference. And there's a larger price difference. So, anyway, if we go up to 4K ultra settings, neither GPU is doing a very good job, although interestingly, the 6700 XT actually pulls ahead in this situation with a small 6% lead. Although it's a Pyrrhic victory in the sense that neither GPU is doing well here. Obviously, if you're going to play at 4K, you should probably just buy a stronger GPU, or if you were using one of these GPUs on a budget, you would need to turn down to much lower settings and probably upscale to get a more playable experience. Hey, let's jump to some other very recent games. This is Star Wars Jedi Survivor at the 1080p epic settings with ray tracing enabled. And expectedly, with ray tracing enabled here, the 4060 Ti is about 14% faster. Although this is a game that can report a lot of VRAM usage, so I was curious what would happen, but it is looking like the 4060 Ti is able to stay ahead here. Again, 14% lead on the averages, 7% on the 1% lows. 4060 Ti is averaging a little over 70 FPS, and the 6700 XT is kind of in the mid-60s. If we go down to the high settings and turn off ray tracing, we now see a 6% performance lead for the 4060 Ti over the 6700 XT. Neither GPU is really going over the 8GB limit here, so it's not the it's not the VRAM issue that's holding the 4060 Ti back here. It's just the fact that in this game, at the high settings, it just doesn't appear to be that much faster. We are seeing about 100 FPS on the 4060 Ti and kind of in the mid-90s on the 6700 XT. So they're both offering a high refresh rate, good experience. Now, if we go up to 1440p and go back to the maximum settings, so the Epic preset with ray tracing turned on, we now see a 13% lead for the 4060 Ti with a 27% lead in the 1% lows. And neither GPU is giving an amazing experience here. We're not getting 60 FPS. In the mid-40s on the 6700 XT, and the upper 40s, almost about 50 on the 4060 Ti. So, I mean, certainly playable, especially if you're on a variable refresh rate screen. But personally, I would think it would make more sense to turn down settings or use some kind of upscaling. So what if we turn off ray tracing and go down to the high settings? Now the 4060 Ti is a lot closer to being a little over the 60 FPS mark, and the 6700 XT is closing in right on that about 60 FPS mark. In the end, we see a 5% lead for the 4060 Ti. So again, small lead when we turn off the ray tracing. And apologies that the footage is not completely identical here. I was doing my best to do an identical run. But anyway, the numbers should be pretty close here anyway. The point is the performance is very similar, and they are both able to get around 60 FPS at 1440p high settings. Not too big of a difference between the two. Now at 4K, I'm not going to bother showing you Epic with RT on because it was a disaster for both GPUs. But if we go down to the high settings, you could at least get a 30-ish FPS experience. Not, again, that's how I would recommend you play it, but it is certainly a thing you could do. And it's a 7% lead for the 4060 Ti. Again, with the ray tracing disabled, it's single-digit percentages lead over this 6700 XT. So, interesting stuff, but like I said, I'm testing 4K really more for science here to see how they scale at different resolutions. Now, let's go to Plague Tale Requiem. This is one of the best looking games out there. It's a current gen console only, no cross-gen. And this is a custom engine from this developer at 1080p Ultra. We're seeing a 13% lead for the 4060 Ti, 11% lead in the 1% lows. They're both doing very well, again, at the 1080p Ultra settings. And this game is a lot harder to run when you jump up to 1440p. And this game does not have FSR. It does have its own kind of inbuilt resolution scaler, but the game does have DLSS and DLSS frame generation. So since they weren't doing great at 1440p Ultra, I thought I'd show off the fact that, well, this game does support some features here for Nvidia that it doesn't for AMD. So the relative performance of 8% lead for the 4060 Ti is given at the native 1440p, but the 4060 Ti could enable DLSS quality to then jump to a very high frame rate with a low enough input latency that enabling frame generation actually makes sense and feels very playable, and gets a very good image quality. Personally, on my 4090 at 4K, I actually played this game with frame generation turned on, and I felt like it looked very good and did improve my experience, especially when the game becomes CPU limited, where frame generation can boost past a CPU limit when no amount of additional actual GPU horsepower can. So it is a good feature, and I think is worth considering, but it is situational. Now, at 4K Ultra, both GPUs are struggling, although the 4060 Ti actually has a 19% lead here, and then a 30% lead in the 1% lows. I was not expecting this, because in the past when we looked at the higher settings, it seemed to not scale as well at 4K. Now, all that being said, it's averaging around 30 FPS and frequently dips below it, so make of it what you will. Now, Resident Evil 4 Remake, when it launched, actually would not even run on an 8 GB card at the max preset, which includes ray tracing. However, it's had patches since launch, and it now actually does run. Now, interestingly, because this has ray tracing, the 4060 Ti is 19% ahead, although the 6700 XT is ahead by 6% in the 1% lows. So it could be that we're getting a little bit more stuttering on the 4060 Ti, although it's a higher actual frame rate. Now, that being said, I actually don't think the ray tracing looks very good in this game. So if you go to the prioritize graphics preset, which has most things turned up, but turns down a bit of the texture streaming cache and turns off ray tracing, both GPUs actually get an amazing, really nice high refresh rate experience, around 120 FPS on the 6700 XT and around 141 on the 4060 Ti, giving it a 17% lead. Now, going up to 1440p max settings, which again includes ray tracing, now we're seeing the 6700 XT ahead despite the fact that we're using ray tracing and it was behind at 1080p. I think this is the VRAM issue finally spilling over a little bit too much. 13% lead on average, but 4.3 times faster in the 1% lows because of the horrible stutters that we encountered on the 4060 Ti. However, if you just go to the prioritize graphics preset, which turns off ray tracing, turns down the texture streaming cache a little bit, and now functions well within an 8 GB VRAM buffer, we now see the 4060 Ti pull ahead by 7% and 9% in the 1% lows, and both GPUs are giving a good refresh rate, with the 4060 Ti over 90 FPS and the 6700 XT in the upper 80s. Honestly, even on my 4090, I turned off ray tracing in this game because I just thought it looked bad. To be honest, it was very noisy in the water reflections. I also turned off the screen space reflections. I honestly thought the cube maps were less distracting because they weren't as noisy. Anyway, at 4K max preset, the 6700 XT is ahead by 11% and almost 3 times faster in the 1% lows. Again, because this is spilling over the VRAM buffer and the 4060 Ti is suffering. It's actually somewhat playable on the 6700 XT, but the frame rate's not great. I do think it would make sense to turn down, if we go down to the prioritize graphics preset, we're now getting more like a 50-ish FPS experience, and the 4060 Ti is ahead by 2%, and they're tied in the 1% lows. Overall, this game doesn't have DLSS, so that's not something you could use here. It does have FSR2, but, and there are DLSS mods and things like that, but I'm testing the games without mods enabled. Now, let's go ahead and look at a PS5 game that has been ported to PC with Returnal. And I thought this one's interesting because a lot of PS5 games, like Forspoken and The Last of Us, use massive amounts of VRAM, and this one doesn't. You can see both in my Afterburner stats as well as the game's actual built-in benchmark, it's only reporting around 5 GB or so of, actual VRAM usage here at the 1080p Epic settings. The 4060 Ti is only leading by 4% and 8% in the 1% lows. They're both averaging over 90 FPS though, so they're both doing really well at 1080p Epic. If we go up to 1440p Epic settings, they're both averaging near 70 FPS, a little bit over on the 4060 Ti, a little bit under on the 6700 XT, and that's giving us a 4% lead for the 4060 Ti, although it does have a 24% lead in the 1% lows. I'm not quite sure why. If you actually look at the frame time graph on the 6700 XT, it does look a bit more stuttery than the 4060 Ti does, and I'm not sure why, but it does. So there you go. Now, they're both doing really well here, and again, this PS5 game doesn't use that much VRAM, so it certainly seems to be a game-by-game basis. Even at 4K Epic settings, it's not using all that much VRAM. So still well within the 8 GB budget, and we're seeing this 8% lead for the 4060 Ti and 12% lead in the 1% lows. So I guess all I can say is not every game and not even every PS5 game ported to PC has the same issues. But we certainly are seeing games where the 8 GB VRAM buffer is an issue. This just isn't one of them. Now, Forspoken is a PS5 exclusive game that has been ported to PC, and this one does have VRAM issues. So at the ultra high preset, which is the maximum, which does include some ray tracing, the 6700 XT is actually ahead. I don't have a meaningful 1% low number. They're both averaging around 60 FPS, but the 6700 XT is slightly ahead, despite the fact that ray tracing is enabled because we're going over the VRAM budget. And if you go up to 1440p at the same maximum settings, which again includes ray tracing, once again we see the 6700 XT ahead by 5%, although both GPUs aren't doing really great here. We're around 40 FPS average, so I think it would actually make sense at 1440p to turn down settings on both GPUs. And especially try to rein in the VRAM budget on the 4060 Ti. At 4K, both GPUs are tied, but they're tied at like 19 frames per second. So it doesn't really matter. They're both losing. But I mean, obviously, both of these GPUs, as we have established, don't make sense at maximum settings 4K gaming. So just don't do that. Anyway, let's move on to the next game. Unreal Engine 5 is the big engine of the future for so many new games. And at 1080p maximum settings, that's epic, including ray tracing on with hardware acceleration, we're seeing a 17% lead for the 4060 Ti. It's averaging right around 60 frames per second, with the 6700 XT averaging a little over 50 frames per second. So it is definitely the difference between being 60 FPS and not being 60 FPS. Again, though, this does have ray tracing enabled, although this is one of the lighter ray tracing workloads. It's not something like, RT Ultra and Cyberpunk or something like that. But anyway, if you go down to the high settings and turn off ray tracing, the game still looks quite good. You still have Lumen and Nanite and virtual shadow maps and all that stuff, just turned down a bit. Now the GPUs are basically tied with a 1% lead for the 6700 XT, although a more meaningful 13% lead in the 1% lows, and they're both getting very close to 100 frames per second. So in Unreal Engine 5 games, it looks like you might struggle to max them out at a high refresh rate, but at some reasonable quality settings, at least going off of Fortnite, this is what we have. Now, why am I testing Fortnite? I'm not really testing Fortnite. I know you wouldn't really play at 1440p Epic RT on. I'm really trying to test Unreal Engine 5, and this is the only game we have to do it. Also, I'm getting the side-by-sides by doing a game replay feature. Some people always ask, how do you get identical footage in a multiplayer game? It's a replay feature. Anyway, at these settings, with, again, ray tracing enabled, the 4060 Ti is 17% ahead on average and 14% ahead in the 1% lows, although neither GPU is actually doing a great job here. Also, I don't know why in the replay feature, one of them actually showed me scoping in and the other one didn't in that. Anyway, minor difference. For the course of the benchmark run, it shouldn't be impacting performance that much. But anyway, if we go down to the high settings at 1440p without the hardware accelerated ray tracing, these GPUs are actually tied, and they're also very usable at 1440p. They're getting about 67 frames per second average at the moment. So they are averaging over 60 frames per second. And the 1% lows are a small lead for the 6700 XT. So overall, it does look like these GPUs are usable at 1440p in Unreal Engine 5, at least in Fortnite. Again, other games might push things farther than this one does. However, if you want to go up to 4K resolution, I would once again recommend a stronger GPU. At the high settings, not even the epic settings, we're averaging in kind of the mid-30s, although the 4060 Ti actually did pull ahead by 6% here on average and 4% in the 1% lows, which was really only interesting to me in the fact that usually we've seen it kind of scale a little bit worse at the higher resolution, whereas here it was tied at 1440p, but is now 6% ahead at 4K. But still, we're talking single-digit percentage differences that you wouldn't really notice. Now, Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, we're looking at the balanced preset and starting out at 1080p. I don't go up to the extreme preset when testing this competitive game because it's a competitive game. Fortnite, I was at high settings because it was Unreal Engine 5. This were more like actually playing the game. 7% lead for the 4060 Ti. Now, I actually find that as a very big win for the 4060 Ti, and the reason I say that is because historically, this game has favored AMD GPUs as like a massive outlier in their favor. Usually, the AMD GPUs massively outperform in this game relative to other games. Going up to 1440p at the balanced preset, we see the 4060 Ti ahead by 2%. But again, I find this really interesting. And I think one reason why we might be seeing this is The 4060 Ti has a large L2 cache, which is different than the 3000 series of GPUs. So I'm wondering if this game is a game that likes cache, because I know AMD's 6000 series, they have that infinity cache. So I'm wondering if this game just likes cache. This is my personal theory on why the 4060 Ti does so well in this game, similar to how AMD's 6000 series does. Now, let's go up to 4K at the balance settings, and surprisingly, both GPUs are actually around 70 FPS. It's a 3% lead for the 6700 XT, although 2% lead in the 1% lows for the 4060 Ti, but at this point, again, that's almost just variance. It's not particularly notable. I don't think when playing you would really notice which GPU you were using. So, very interesting results overall in this set of benchmarks. I need to give you guys some final thoughts. So does it matter that the 4060 Ti is launching with 8 gigabytes of VRAM? Yes, I think we saw in the benchmarks that while some games are still operating just fine with 8 gigabytes of VRAM, no real concern, there absolutely were situations where the VRAM was spilling over and it was slowing down the card at settings that would otherwise have been very playable at both 1080p and 1440p. And the games that I'm testing are major releases that a lot of people would be interested in playing, and these are releases that have already had many patches applied specifically to address issues with not running well on cards with 8 gigabytes of VRAM. So what we're seeing here is actually games that are running better on 8 gigabytes of VRAM than they did when they initially launched. So I'm not saying that 8 gigabytes of VRAM is completely unusable, because we did see that usually by reducing the settings a notch down, going down to high instead of ultra, that usually you can then rein in that VRAM budget. You can also use things like DLSS to help rein in the VRAM budget. But the point is, this is a powerful graphics card launching at $400 in 2023, and it has 8 gigabytes of VRAM. And that was already questionable with the previous generation. Now, if you bought an 8 gigabyte card of about this power level, like the RTX 3070, 3 years ago, well, you got a few years where that 8 gigabytes of VRAM wasn't too big of a deal, and it's now getting to the point where you're having to turn things down a little bit. The 4060 Ti is launching now when you're already having to turn things down a little bit in some of the major releases that just came out. And that is more concerning because most people will hang on to their GPU for at least 2 years, a full product cycle, and more frequently 4 years where you skip a generation and upgrade on the next one. We have always seen VRAM usage go up over time. Games want to use more, they increase graphic settings, they push the boundaries, more powerful consoles release, all sorts of reasons why VRAM usage goes up over time, not down. So if you're buying a graphics card that is already right on the borderline between having to turn down settings and not, on day one of its release, that's not a good feeling. Now, especially at the $400 price point, that is a lot of money. The GPU we're comparing it against in this video launched at a much higher price than $400, but in the current market, because it is over 2 years old now, does only cost $320 brand new. So the 6700 XT comes in with 12 gigabytes of VRAM for $320. Now, is the 6700 XT as good as the 4060 Ti? Am I saying that you should buy one instead of the 4060 Ti? Not necessarily. Its main advantage is the extra VRAM, and we did see cases where that helped it take a small performance lead over the 4060 Ti. However, the 4060 Ti is generally a little bit faster when not using ray tracing and not held back by its VRAM capacity, and when ray tracing is enabled, more noticeably faster. You know, in lighter ray tracing workloads, though, you know, what do we see? 15% faster, 17% faster in lighter ray tracing workloads. However, in heavier ray tracing workloads, we did see a massive performance advantage for the 4060 Ti. Also, DLSS upscaling looks better than FSR2 upscaling does, and you have frame generation. And frame generation, I don't want to keep going into this in super detail in every single video I release, but it is a good feature, but it's a situational feature. It's because of its increased latency, you would not use it in competitive games. So if you're just into competitive gaming, doesn't really help you out. It's also a situational usage even in single-player games, because for one thing, not every game supports it. Currently, I'm playing The Last of Us Part 1 and Star Wars Jedi Survivor, two of the biggest AAA releases of the year. Neither of them has frame generation. So even if I wanted to use it in a single-player game, it might just not have it. And then even if it does have it, as I demonstrated in the frame generation testing in this video, you want to have a high enough base frame rate before you enable it. So while it could take us from 40 frames per second to over 70 frames per second in Cyberpunk 2077 with Ray Tracing Ultra enabled, I wouldn't use it to do that because the latency at that frame rate is too high for it to feel good to use. I would want to boost frame rate further by reducing settings or using DLSS upscaling, which at 1080p looks okay, but in my opinion, not great. I would rather not have to use upscaling at 1080p. The higher the resolution you're at, the less noticeable the upscaling is because you have more pixels to work with in the first place. Anyway, the point is, I like frame generation. I use it in single-player games, even on my 4090, which already has a lot of horsepower. However, the 4090 usually has no issues hitting at least around 60 frames per second before I enable it. I think it's really at its strongest point when it's helping you push past CPU limitations, which we've seen in a lot of recent releases, especially in Unreal Engine 4. So again, I think it's a cool feature. So does the 4060 Ti have reasons to buy it over a 6700 XT? Yes. It does cost 25% more though, and it's certainly not 25% faster unless you're in a heavy ray tracing workload. It also has less VRAM. So, I mean, it does have better energy efficiency. It has AV1 encoding because it's from the newer generation. A lot of productivity applications are programmed to run better on Nvidia GPUs, all of that. But here's the thing. If the 4060 Ti had come out with 16 gigabytes of VRAM, and why 8 versus 16? You can only fit so much VRAM onto a certain memory bus. At a 128-bit bus, your choices are basically limited to 4, 8, or 16. You can't fit 12 without doing stuff that would mess with the memory bus and probably make the card actually run worse, not better. Anyway, the point is, the way they designed it with the 128-bit bus meant this was going to be an 8GB card or a 16GB card. And they're releasing a 16GB version, but for $100 more. It's going to cost $500. Nvidia really should have made there only be one version and it be the 16GB version and had it cost $400. Or if they really want to split the models, they should have charged maybe $450 for the 16GB version. It's only 8GB more VRAM, and while I don't have the exact numbers right in front of me, I would be shocked if 8GB of VRAM cost anywhere near $100. I would imagine it is far, far less. So, in other words, I really think asking $500 for the 16GB version is kind of silly. It should have been a $400 card, and if they had to have a 128-bit bus, they should have put 16GB on it. If that was the case, imagine how this video would be different. I would say, well, you know, it's 25% more money than the 6700 XT, but it has more VRAM, not less. It has more features, which is all good, all of those other advantages that I just said, and it's a little bit faster, and it would be, on average, actually a larger performance gain because of the situations where it was held back by VRAM. It wouldn't have been held back by VRAM. So, anyway, the point is, if you're buying a card around $320, the 6700 XT is still a really good choice. And do you want to spend the extra money on the 4060 Ti? Unfortunately, I have to give a qualified, well, it kind of sucks it's 8 gigabytes, but you do get something for your money in other areas. And I really wish that I could say, give a better recommendation than that for a next-gen product. And this is where we are. So what do you guys think? Are you holding out for the 16 gigabyte version? Because the problem with that is that means it's going to be a price competitor to the $500 RX 6800 XT. Well, those are still in stock from the previous generation, which are also 16 gigabytes, but should be significantly fast. If the 6700 XT is already a close competitor in performance, the 6800 XT is significantly faster than a 6700 XT. So anyway, it is what it is. I think that's what I've got for you guys today. Hopefully you found the benchmarks interesting. I thought the VRAM difference here made this a fascinating comparison. There's a lot I really like about the 4060 Ti. I just wish it had more VRAM and didn't charge $100 more for the model that will have 8 gigabytes more VRAM at 16. I hope all of you have an excellent day.